When aspiring to stand on the shoulders of giants, be sure of one's ability. Otherwise, you may end up standing among the shadows.
Sea of Stars was developed by Sabotage Studio and released on August 29, 2023. Sabotage claims one of the most beloved RPGs of all time, and one of my personal favorite games, Chrono Trigger, as a main source of inspiration. And with gorgeous pixel graphics, a large world to explore, mysteries to unravel, adventure to be had, bosses to defeat, and a whole cast of new friends to make along the way, Sea of Stars was able to generate a considerable amount of pre-release hype. Not to mention the fact that Sabotage's previous outing, The Messenger, had already found a modicum of success in the indie game scene. To top it all off, they were even able to secure the support of Yasunori Mitsuda, the man behind most of Chrono Trigger's outstanding soundtrack, as a guest composer. In short, the chefs over at Sabotage were cooking with a recipe for success. So, does Sea of Stars live up to the hype? Is it the next Chrono Trigger, or is it just nostalgia bait? This will be the most ambitious deconstruction of a video game I've ever attempted, and while I've done my best to be concise, there is so much worth discussing that the length of the script really can't be helped. Furthermore, in order to prevent myself from being limited to surface-level commentary and ambiguous references, it will be impossible for me to avoid some light spoilers. Don't worry, the kind of spoilers we're talking about are things like gameplay elements or the visuals of certain areas or characters, given without context. While I do plan on talking at length about the story as well, I don't intend to reveal any major plot points. Also, I will do my best to keep any specific late-game references vague enough that only people who have enjoyed the experience for themselves will know what I'm referencing, while still not being so cryptic that those of you who have yet to play the game will be unable to understand or relate to the general idea. That said, this is a deconstruction, not a review. The point of this video is to analyze the game and measure its worth, to articulate the experience it offers, and to share my perceptions of it. This means we'll be taking a close look at all of its individual pieces, as well as how they come together as a whole. So, if this introduction and the video length weren't enough of a clue, it's time to grab your scuba gear, because we're going in deep. I'm thankful that my format for these deconstruction videos starts with the visuals first, because I feel like in the case of Sea of Stars, this will be the least controversial aspect to cover. Whether you hate or love the game, whether you've played it through to completion or you're just now seeing it for the first time, I think most of us can agree. In terms of its visual design, Sea of Stars is truly outstanding. What the art team at Sabotage has been able to do with pixel art is nothing short of praiseworthy. Everything from the characters to the backgrounds to the very color palette itself is aesthetically pleasing. The unique areas of the world are as detailed as they are varied. The character designs are distinct and appealing, and the boss designs are as interesting as they are imposing. But pictures are worth thousands of even the most thoughtfully crafted words, so let me just show you. The following are things that I considered some of the most noteworthy highlights and definitive aspects of Sea of Stars in regards to its visual identity. The game combines distant backgrounds with the use of parallax to create a level of depth and immersion that's fairly rare in 2D games. The backgrounds aren't just some tiled clouds or mountains, but instead they're entire landscapes that actually change as you progress through the area. Not only did this help areas feel more distinct and interesting, but also more authentic. It added a layer of realism which, for a pixel art game, I could only describe as the very best kind of ironic. And I absolutely adored when these backgrounds were used to showcase set pieces or grandiose vistas. They were like a treat for the eyes, and were clearly crafted by very talented and passionate artists. Another example, and maybe this is to be expected, but the attack animations are spectacular, and not just the attack animations. The animation in general is fantastic and really brings the world to life. Sea of Stars is no doubt painterly in screenshots, but somehow it manages to look even better in motion. Moving on, look at the level of detail for the character sprites in the dialogue boxes. While not the equal of full animation, as dialogue boxes tend to be, the characters were still able to convey real emotions and even nuanced expressions, which really helped to sell some of the writing. And when the pixel art simply isn't the best tool for the job, the game employs cutscenes in the form of more traditional 2D animation. While I quite liked what this feature added to the game in concept, I did feel they were used a bit too sporadically and far, far too infrequently. As in, it's such a rarity that it's almost weird that it was included at all, which is a shame. I really would have loved to see more of this stuff, but oh well. Next on the list is the lighting, which is something else. I'm not sure I've ever seen anything quite like this in a pixel art game. While the graphics themselves may allude to the 16-bit era of yore, the lighting system is unapologetically modern. Illumination levels and color change in response to light sources. Light scatters and shadows are cast in real time. I'm not sure what technical wizardry was required to achieve this feat, but it allows the visuals to pop in a way that is both impressive as well as immersive. Other relatively modern conventions, such as reflections and transparency, are also used to great effect. Just look at this. And this. This is just an ordinary room, but as soon as I saw this area, I knew I'd have to showcase it in this video. Simply stunning. But this is just me nerding out about some technical effects and attention to detail. The game has a lot more to offer. Just take a look for yourself. Perhaps most impressive, at least for me, is the clarity and the cohesion of it all. Let me explain. By clarity, I mean, well, okay, so by its very nature, pixel art as a medium lacks the detail of a traditional drawing. And almost all works of pixel art, especially in a medium as robust and multifaceted as video games, are going to experience some level of ambiguity. In other words, with pixel art, it's not always easy for your eyes to understand exactly what they're supposed to be looking at. Like that. What is that? This is not the case with Sea of Stars. Even the little details are crisp and clear. If the game wants to show you something, it will do so with an almost profound lucidity. As for cohesion, I mean to say that the art direction has a theme, and it sticks to it. Nothing clashes. They might make use of modern techniques in a retro format, but these two concepts are not at odds with one another. Instead, they are blended beautifully and seamlessly into a symbiotic harmony, giving Sea of Stars uniquely arresting visuals. In fact, the marriage of retro ideals with modern conventions extends beyond just the game's aesthetics, and it could be argued that this is in fact the game as a whole's core identity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, just think of how the effects of the sun and the moon are both spectacular to behold, and yet they can work together to create an eclipse, which offers a visual splendor that neither celestial body alone can match.
See what I did there?
The soundtrack in Sea of Stars is a blast. While the sound identity of the instruments used are clearly inspired by the Super Nintendo era, the composition feels modern and fresh. I constantly found myself bobbing my head and finger drumming on my desk along to the tunes in new areas, and especially the battle themes. Each track is unique, powerful, and purposeful. Whether it's setting the pace or the mood, the music is always informing the player and evoking emotion. And it does this with a level of expertise that's impossible not to notice. It's borderline manipulative, and I mean that in the best possible way. If the plot or the exposition or the circumstance wants the player to feel a certain way, the music is capable of getting them there all by itself, with or without context. And yet, it does this without upstaging the game itself. The songs are always there to serve a purpose, to enhance the experience. So when I say this, I mean it as the highest form of praise. The designers and writers at Sabotage could not have asked for more from their sound team. Mr. Brown and Mitsuda-san were slaves to the experience itself, not to their songs, not to their egos, and yet, they were still able to craft dozens of tunes that stand on their own. At one point near the end of the game, I was caught off guard by how close one particular song was to my taste in music outside of video games, specifically heavy metal. What impressed me most about this song was that the drums were just so definitively on brand for what one might expect out of a metal song. As someone who's spent a few hours behind a drum set, I found myself thinking, that's something a real drummer would play. I was compelled to search for the song on YouTube, where I discovered Sea of Stars composer Eric W. Brown's YouTube page. I was impressed to see that this legend had playlists set up for the game's full soundtrack, but what I saw next was personally delightful. The oldest uploads to his YouTube channel were videos of him drumming heavy metal. I kid you not, when I saw this, I grinned from ear to ear. It was a whole moment for me where I felt truly connected to the art and the artist. It was as if my particular tastes had not only been considered, but even catered to, and it was a special experience that I will always cherish about this game. To be clear, Sea of Stars contains a wide variety of musical genres, most of which are exactly what one would imagine coming from a fantasy setting and a magical world. There is ambiance and atmosphere and no shortage of catchy melodies. But as I listen to the soundtrack while writing this script, it's become more apparent to me that the compositions were written by a man who loves percussion, and it gives the soundtrack a level of detail, of richness and complexity that I feel is fairly unique, not just for the genre, but for video games as a whole and even other entertainment mediums. And I must admit, it's something I found very enjoyable. This may or may not be why the music in Sea of Stars resonates with me so strongly, but suffice it to say that it does. That said, I realize I have my biases. I love the music, but it's possible that it won't move people the way it did me. And whether or not it will stand on its own against the greats of the genre, I believe only time will tell. One thing I do know, which I find a bit disheartening, is that the video game music cover scene on YouTube has failed almost entirely to respond to this game's soundtrack, and for no reason that I can discern other than the very obvious. It simply doesn't appeal to the masses the way it does to me. But who knows? Maybe the songs are just difficult to cover, or maybe they're being worked on right now. Maybe it's because YouTube search sucks balls nowadays, or maybe it's something else entirely. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent, and it's not like this very specific and niche metric is the best way to evaluate the topic. The best way to do that is with your ears. I used mine, and it turns out I liked this game's music. I rocked the fuck out to this game's music. I have no complaints. Your mileage may vary. As for the sound effects and non-music audio, the game does a fine job as well. The actions the characters perform, running, climbing, swimming, attacking, defending, casting spells, it all sounds good. Some things are quite satisfying and some others were a bit underwhelming, but for the most part the sound effects did their job. There was one thing, however, that irked me a bit. Described as dialogue bloops in the game's audio options, there are sound effects that play when a character is speaking, a sort of 8-bit gibberish to give the character a voice. Like an incredibly tame version of what happens in Animal Crossing or The Sims, or perhaps a better example would be Undertale. This was a little bit annoying at first, but it's sort of an acquired taste. Because the bloops vary from character to character, they're a subtle-ish form of personality expression, and I can appreciate the idea. It also means that some are more annoying than others. So, on a handful of occasions, including my first time playing the game, I found it to be more distracting than it was immersive. What I did not know, however, until much later, was that this could be turned off, so it's nice that the option is there for those who take issue with it. I don't think I would have used it, because for me the whole thing is a little more of a nitpick than some major issue, but I imagine for some people it will be considerably more off-putting. Now, let's finally get to the most substantial aspect of this game, and of most games, the meat and potatoes if you will, the gameplay loop. The gameplay in Sea of Stars can be broken down into 3 distinctly separate categories: combat, exploration, and puzzles. Within these 3 categories, Sea of Stars hits its highest highs and its lowest lows. Both the best and the worst of what the game has to offer can be found in the gameplay. Side note, there are also a small handful of minigames, but most of those are games of chance except for an in-universe board game called Wheels, which can be played at the inns in each town. Wheels is cute, more on that later. First, let's talk about combat. At its core, this is your typical turn-based RPG. The player's party members and the enemy party's members take turns attacking each other. The goal is to reduce all enemy combatants' HP to 0 before the same happens to the player's party. Different enemies will have different strengths and weaknesses as well as different abilities. And while party members also have their own unique abilities and combat identity, their roles are much more loosely defined and are a bit open to interpretation. There are no rigid classes like tank or healer or damage dealer. However, it's definitely fair to say that the game can be played this way, and because each character has their own strengths and weaknesses, that may even be optimal. Still, every character can do damage, every character can take a hit, and every character offers some kind of support. For the most part, this is all fairly standard stuff for a game of this genre. But what does Sea of Stars do to separate itself from its contemporaries? Well, it does have a novel idea or two, and we'll get to that, but in large part, it's how the game blends together elements and concepts from various sources into one unified experience that makes it special. One example is the inclusion of timing-based button presses during battle animations. If the player presses a button at the right time, they can be rewarded with increased damage or spell potency for their turn, and decreased damage during the enemy's turn. They may even include multiple button presses for attacks with multiple parts, holding the button to charge up an attack's power, and in one case, the joystick is even used to guide a spell to its targets. While this general idea was first popularized by Super Mario RPG: The Legend of the Seven Stars, it's not a gameplay feature that is particularly common in RPGs, and I was happy to see its inclusion here. I've always absolutely loved this about Super Mario RPG, and wondered why most games opted to forego using it. It allows the player to be a more active participant in battle, rewarded for reflexes and attention to detail, and it makes the combat feel more involved and interesting. It just feels good. As an encounter progresses, a meter will fill, and this will allow party members to do combo techniques. Up to 3 combo points can be generated at a time, and some skills will require 2 or even all 3 combo points to be used once. If this sounds extremely similar to Chrono Trigger, that's because it is, and all the ways in which Sea of Stars will inevitably be compared to Chrono Trigger, this is perhaps the most obvious example. Unlike Chrono Trigger, however, there is less bloat in this category. Not every possible combination of party members and combo points has a potential technique attached to it. But that's okay, because there are still a range of different options and there's virtually no redundancy. Each combo has its specific utility in combat that can't really be replaced or replicated by another combo. It's well done, and it works. It just feels good. In addition to normal skills and combo techniques, there are also ultimate skills. Essentially, this is the limit break concept from Final Fantasy. The ultimate skill bar will fill by using normal skills as well as by spending combo points. A party member will perform a unique animation and ability befitting their character, dealing massive damage to the enemy party in that character's given element. These animations are bold and resplendent, and frankly, the spectacle is an absolute highlight in a game with already stunning visuals. These things look so damn cool, and they occur just infrequently enough that they never really become tiresome. Each party member has their own unique ultimate, which means selecting which character will use this powerful ability becomes a strategic decision. There's always a sense of reward and satisfaction when letting loose an ultimate. It just feels good. Another nice feature is that there are no random encounters. Every enemy combatant can be seen while exploring, battled at will, avoided if desired, and even snuck upon for a small attack bonus. If the enemy catches sight of the player, they will attempt to engage, which forces a bit of pressure onto the player to be decisive and also makes the enemies feel like a more organic part of the environment. Again, it's not that Sea of Stars created this concept, but it's not exactly the industry standard, and more importantly, it's just done very well. Like the Super Mario RPG example, it's the choice to include it and the execution which matter here. It just feels good. The way the enemy spells work is perhaps the most iconic part of combat in Sea of Stars. When casting a spell, an icon, or in most cases several icons, will appear above or next to an enemy. These icons denote the attack types the enemy must be hit with in order to interrupt the spell that they are casting. For example, an enemy may have a sword and a sun icon next to them. This means that if they're hit with sword damage as well as sun damage before their turn, that the cast will be interrupted and their turn will be reset. Using this to the player's advantage is therefore the key to success in many encounters. This is especially true in boss fights, but when you factor in multiple enemies with multiple countdown timers until their turn, and the fact that various skills, combo techniques, and even ultimates can clear multiple locks simultaneously, the game introduces an element of strategy that, at its best, can actually be quite thoughtful. A little bit of planning, prioritizing, and even a little bit of luck are all blended together to make the player stop and think about each attack. While we're certainly not talking about the same kind of strategy as an intense chess match or giving the player galaxy brain revelations, I never once found myself just spamming a single attack to thoughtless victory like I have in basically every other RPG I've ever played. It just feels good. But wait, there's more. We haven't even talked about live mana and boosting. Every time a party member lands an attack on an enemy, in addition to refilling some of their MP bar, there are also some orbs that will fall onto the ground. This is live mana. When live mana is in play, any attack or skill can be powered up with live mana. Using live mana to power up is called boosting. While powering up abilities seems obvious enough, what makes it interesting is that boosting also adds the corresponding party member's element into their next attack. This plays directly into the spell lock system, and using live mana to add elemental damage that will remove locks is a vital part of the game's strategy. Here's a great example. The enemy is going to cast in one turn but has 5 locks. 2 swords representing slash damage, 2 hammers representing blunt damage, and a sun representing, the sun. At first glance, this seems impossible to overcome, and in some, maybe even most situations, it is. But if there is a little live mana in play and at least one combo point available, then it can be done. Zale boosts with live mana, giving the sun elemental damage to his next attack. Then Zale, who does sword damage, initiates Solstice Strike, a combo technique with Valir, who does blunt damage. Finally, when the attack lands, the player perfectly times their button press to ensure bonus damage, which, in the case of Solstice Strike, manifests by having the attack hit a second time. That means, when added all together, Solstice Strike will deal slashing damage twice, blunt damage twice, and Zale's initial live mana boost adds in the sun elemental damage, clearing all 5 locks and interrupting the spell in just one turn. These opportunities for player expression are not only fun, but also extremely useful, making them a great little dopamine hit, which means, of course, it just feels good. The dynamic between skills, which require MP, and attacks, which restore MP, is fairly interesting. Since party members have fairly shallow MP pools, the player is encouraged to be more strategic and deliberate when using skills. And while there are only a handful of skills to choose from for each character, they offer enough potency, utility, and variety overall. While some may describe the overall selection of skills as extremely limited, especially compared to many other RPGs, I would be more apt to describe the selection as lean. As with the combo techniques, there's just no redundancy. There may not be dozens of them to choose from, but they all serve a purpose and fill their own niche. This also means no scrolling through pages of useless skills when deciding what move to use next, which keeps the flow of combat steady and allows the player to focus on the other aspects of strategy at play. Say it with me now, it just feels good. One final thing that felt somewhat unusual for a turn-based RPG was being able to swap party members on the fly, even mid-turn, and with no penalty. This was pretty liberating, and while it did seem a tad overpowered, I believe the lock system would have otherwise been nearly impossible to implement in a fun and balanced way.
It just feels good.
Now that we have a general idea of how combat works, it's extremely important to stop for a minute and discuss relics. The reason is because relics have a massive impact on the difficulty of the game in several ways, and I chose to use a few for my playthrough of the game. Specifically, I used Tactician's Medal, Sequent Flare, and eventually, the Falcon-Eyed Parrot. Tactician's Medal gives enemies a 60% damage resistance, increases the damage the player receives by 35%, and removes the ability to consume food items during combat. It also changes how campfires work. Player HP is only healed up to 50%, and MP is not recovered at all. Obviously, this is designed to up the challenge from a vanilla playthrough. After my first couple of hours, I felt the combat was too easy, and that I wasn't being rewarded for my strategies or thoughtfulness, and that my mistakes weren't really being punished. This also meant that even though I couldn't use food items in battle, I still had to collect ingredients and craft new recipes to heal in between fights and to top myself off at campfires. Tactician's Medal moved the difficulty into a much more fulfilling area for me, but the changes it has are profound, so please keep that in mind. The other combat-related relic that I used, Sequent Flare, was actually to my benefit. It adds clarity to successfully timing hits and blocks by providing stronger feedback. In other words, it let me know if I was getting the timing right or not in my combat actions. To be clear, it does not help with the timing. There are other relics for that. It just lets the player know if they got the timing correct or not with absolutely no question. The last relic that I used, the Falcon-Eyed Parrot, aids in exploration. I'll cover this when it comes up later. For now, just know that relics exist and can have a significant impact on the player experience. Some are available from the start of the game, and some are found as the player progresses through the game. Many of them make the game easier, and a handful increase the challenge. What's nice is there are a variety of options, and they can be turned off and on at any time, which allows for a level of customization that traditional difficulty options do not. For example, maybe you're just here for the story, or you're a game journalist trying to get your review online while the topic is still trending. The Amulet of Storytelling doubles your total HP and auto-heals you after every encounter. Or maybe you just want to strategize during battle and the timed button presses aren't your thing. The Adamant Shard ensures double hits on regular attacks, which can help you overcome some of those pesky locks. Or maybe you want to experience the combat exactly as the developers intended it, but you can't stand the fishing. There are relics which can increase the performance of the rod, reel, and line respectively. Neat. I found the relics to be a nice way for the players to adjust the difficulty to their taste. I remember fawning over this method of allowing players to fine-tune their experience when Bastion came out, but I have to give a special nod to Sabotage here for allowing changes that are a bit more thoughtful than simply adjusting percentage values. So, that was my experience with the game's combat, and I gotta say, I really loved it. The elements that Sea of Stars borrows from other games, timing actions, using combo techniques, and show-stopping ultimates, are not only iconic, but are some of my favorite experience from other games in the genre. Having them all together in one experience was a blast. It may be the most joy I've experienced in turn-based RPG combat, and that includes Chrono Trigger, the old-school Final Fantasy games, and even Super Mario RPG. It was just super fun, man. But remember, this was also partly because I took responsibility for my experience by using the relics to tune the difficulty to be exactly what I wanted. However, I will admit that there is a certain lack of depth to the experience that left me wanting more. Even boss fights felt like they were just one layer of strategy away from being truly sublime. There was never any significant struggle, and the most difficult encounters were actually just difficulty spikes from wandering into a new area that maybe wasn't perfectly tuned for my relic setup. Still, I never felt it was necessary to grind, and I never did, but I did spend the majority of the game being pushed close to my limits. Close, but not actually to them. Overall, I feel like the combat experience has been carefully planned and masterfully crafted. Sure, I have a gripe or two, but they only stick out because Sea of Stars does everything else so right. I felt respected and challenged, but never overwhelmed or frustrated. I was given the freedom to form my own strategies, but in a way that always seemed like it was considered and balanced for. Every battle was interesting and every choice felt like it mattered. The combat is the peak of the Sea of Stars experience, and I absolutely loved it. Unlike the combat, which I can only really praise, the exploration is more of a mixed bag. Sometimes it's fine, occasionally it's great, and sometimes, well, it does not feel good. The paths through each area are usually fairly linear, and side paths are typically rather short and easy to identify. This is fine. I enjoyed having a strong sense of direction, and I quite also liked that backtracking was kept to a minimum. This helped tremendously with the pace of the game and kept me engaged with the scripted parts, fighting enemies, completing quests, meeting new characters, pushing the narrative forward, and in general, accomplishing things. This kept me discovering new areas and immersing myself in the atmosphere of the locales, seeing beautiful new scenery, and hearing catchy new music. One thing I enjoyed immensely, as I almost always do, was acquiring new tools that allowed me to revisit old locations and solve mysteries that once eluded me. This is basically the traditional Metroidvania formula, or like in old school Zelda games when you get the boomerang or the hook shot, or perhaps it's most similar to the Pokemon games and HMs. But unlike in those games, these revelations are rather limited. There are only a small handful of these tools scattered throughout the game, one of which comes near the very end and unlocks the majority of these secrets. And, well, there aren't all that many secrets to go back and find anyway. Still, unlocking these new tools was always a highlight of the exploration, even if part of the elation came from the element of exploration and really the game as a whole that I enjoyed the very least. No, that's being a little bit too charitable. It's safe to say I did not enjoy this next aspect of the game at all. And that was searching for stupid hidden collectibles. While Sea of Stars does include puzzles, and we'll get to that next, a lot of the items, and not just collectibles, but weapons, armor, and accessories, were hidden. Some were not hidden very well, and that's okay, and some were hidden so painfully well that I legitimately felt like I was being trolled by the developers and that my time was being intentionally wasted. I'm not kidding. A good 10 to maybe even 20% of my entire playtime in Sea of Stars, which by the way amounted to over 50 hours, was hunting down a handful of ridiculously well-hidden items. It wasn't fun, it wasn't interesting, it didn't really feel rewarding. Sometimes there were clues or hints about certain item locations, and that was nice, but sometimes, at least as far as I can tell, there absolutely wasn't. And while I'm happy to admit that a couple of times I kicked myself for missing an item in the first place, it was just as often that I cursed whatever vindictive bastard at Sabotage had the idea to hide the items there in the first place. The only real saving grace was that relic I mentioned earlier, the falcon-eyed parrot. When active, the player can have the parrot check the map and see if there are any missed items left in a specific region of the game, such as a town or a dungeon. The parrot will confirm or deny the existence of items and even distinguish between collectibles and actual treasure. However, no specific location or other hints are given. I found this relic to be exactly what I wanted when I was hunting down the items I'd missed, and this vague sense of direction is always the kind of assistance I prefer when I resort to getting help in a game. I want to solve the puzzles, so to speak, but I don't want to waste my time looking for it, if that makes sense. So with the parrot, I didn't have to explore the game from beginning to end just hoping I'd see something I missed, and I was able to hone my focus onto specific areas without having the answer deliberately spoon-fed to me. It's just a shame that the concept ended up being a lot better in theory than it was in fact. Even with the help from the parrot, a couple of my treasure hunts drove me insane, and I'm ashamed to admit I still ended up resorting to a guide for the last two of them. You see, the one I'd found right before going to the guide had actually pissed me off with how ridiculously well hidden it was, so I refused to waste my time on the Easter egg hunt any longer, and honestly, I don't regret my decision. This was by far the worst part of the game for me, and without the parrot, it would have soured the experience and my overall opinion of the game. It didn't, honestly, but it was a really close call. So anyway, the puzzles. They were okay. A lot of them were rather simple, and they ended up being a fairly minor aspect of the game, used more as a pacing tool and a break between the combat and exploration sequences. A couple of them had a little bit of complexity to them, but most of the aha moments from solving them were less like aha and more like uh-huh. Where I can commend the game's lack of combat skills as focused or refined, the puzzles fall more into the category of just simple. There are no brainbusters to be found, so take that however you want. For me, it was fine, but with the ability to kind of manipulate time, or at least change the time of day, I was expecting some really interesting puzzle concepts that never manifested themselves. And changing the time of day was more akin to those red and blue switches from older Zelda and newer Mario games than anything as actually significant as affecting time. It's more of an on-off switch. I am as enthusiastic about the puzzles in Sea of Stars as your parents were when you told them you were going to spend the summer trying to be a Twitch streamer. Sure, honey, if it makes you happy, I guess. Okay, what's next? Cooking? It's a menu. A very cute menu that the artist clearly worked very hard on to make the food as vivid and enticing as possible, but it's still a menu. Fishing? It exists. It's not offensive, and I neither loved nor hated it. It exists in that purgatory between overly simplified and needlessly complex, but not in a good way, or a bad way. It just is. it's there. You can do it, and then you have more ingredients for cooking. As far as the minigames go, the only one really worth discussing is Wheels. Wheels is a board game that can be played in each of the various towns, and it's actually pretty fun. I'm not going to bother explaining the rule set because this video is already long enough, and it's significantly more difficult to explain than it is to just try for yourself and figure out after a game or two. I'll just say that Wheels stays true to the core design principles of Sea of Stars. It is not overly complex or particularly deep, but it's fun. My only little complaint is that the opponents in champion matches clearly cheat, which is unfortunate because winning against all of the champions is a requirement for full completion of the game, but also it's fine because they're all still fairly trivial to defeat. So that's it. That's the gameplay for Sea of Stars. It's super great, except for when it's not, which is sometimes, but not as often as when it is great, which is usually. Also, it's occasionally just average. And even the worst of it is still pretty okay. But seriously, it's really pretty great. The plot for Sea of Stars begins with a fairly typical introduction. The hero, or in this case heroes, are special children gifted with special powers that only they and few others are capable of wielding, and the world will rely on them for protection from the forces of evil. You may have noticed I said heroes as in multiple. That's because the role of main protagonist is actually split between two people, Zale and Valir. Born during the summer and winter solstices respectively, these two have access to eclipse magic, which makes them solstice warriors. Zale harnesses the power of the sun, and Valir the moon. I found this to be an interesting concept and looked forward to seeing how Sea of Stars would handle it, but honestly, the dual protagonist thing really adds very little to the narrative. The two are of like mind and objective the entire way through the story. Instead of having two distinct and iconic personalities, the reality is that it feels a lot more like one personality split between two characters. The only meaningful difference between Zale and Valir is in the gameplay itself, with each character having different strengths. They also have no real inner conflict, no trauma, no demons to overcome, no reason to change. They are very much the same characters at the beginning of the game as they are at the end. That's not to say that a lack of character development is always a bad thing. Their childhood friend and the first party member to join the Solstice Warriors, Garl, also lacks any significant character development, but he's funny and brave and outgoing and charismatic and has more protagonist energy than Valir and Zale combined. Look, it's not really a problem and the story proceeds just fine this way, but it feels like having two main protagonists was a novel idea that could have offered far more depth than it ultimately did. So after we meet our trio of friends and their mentors, Valir and Zale go through a training arc, which serves as the game's tutorial, and then they're off on their first mission. While the introduction and the tutorial did feel like they went on just a smidge too long, that's because the plot itself is pretty heavily front-loaded. Once the player is sent into the world, the game focuses much more on exploration than exposition, and only doles out bite-sized pieces of the main story occasionally. That isn't to say there isn't a lot going on. There are plenty of interesting, funny, and even heartwarming events that unfold on the way to the end of the game, but many of them are only tangentially related to the main story. Maybe that's not the right way to word it. The main story is Zale and Valir's story, but their journey as Solstice Warriors who face off against evil is not a linear one. They help people, make new friends and enemies, solve mysteries, and explore their entire world and more before reaching their final confrontation. I have to give props to Sabotage for how they went about this. Instead of having side quests, the side stories and objectives are interwoven into the game's progression threads, and while there are a handful of actually optional, truly side quests that can be completed near the end of the game, these feel so connected to the main narrative that they compel the player to pursue them or miss out on not only the resolution of these stories, but also the peak of Sea of Stars gameplay. This is such a bold and subversive way of urging the player to explore all of the game's content, without making them feel like they're being forced to do a bunch of fetch quests or any of the other trivial slog that comes along with most RPGs. As is the case with any game, or even medium, the plot and the story are going to get drastically different mileage for different people. Whether or not you find the characters or their journey to be interesting is far more dependent upon your own interest than it is on the game itself. That said, Sea of Stars plays it pretty safe when it comes to the plot. Character development is minimal and some of the aspects of the plot are a bit predictable. However, I think the execution, for the most part, is really solid. Some of the characters are extremely likable and the game is not afraid to show its sense of humor. I actually chuckled quite a bit and legitimately belly laughed a couple of times too. But in general, the word I kept repeating in my head while playing the game was charming. While the story and the characters may have been lacking novelty, they were just so damn likable. There are no small number of cliches, but the writers were very well aware of this and leaned fully into the idea. I don't want to spoil anything, but in some cases they really leaned into the idea. This actually resulted in some of the funniest aspects of the game. One time I was given an objective, and then on my way to that objective, there were half a dozen signs pointing me in the right direction and holding my hand the whole way there. Each sign almost within seeing distance of the previous one. At first I was annoyed, but by the third or fourth sign I realized it was a gag, and it changed from annoying to funny. At the end of the day, cliches are cliches for a reason. It's also worth noting that there were a handful of genuinely unexpected moments and some emotionally charged scenes that packed a bit of a punch for a game that spends most of its time feeling upbeat and quirky. I'm not going to say I cried, because I didn't, but I definitely felt those things that you feel in your chest and your face when you're just about to. While it's fair to say the writers didn't take a lot of risks with their narrative, the ones they did take paid off. Except for one, sort of. And by that I mean the true ending of the game. The ending after the ending. After the credits roll, the player is told that there is still a quest to finish, and the game flat out states the new quest will be available after reloading the most recent save file. Completing the quest ties all of the narrative's loose ends together and does everything it can to impart feelings of joy and triumph onto the player. And it works. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but when the credits rolled, for the second time, I literally applauded my screen and said out loud, "What a great game!" I felt fulfilled and happy and content and complete and all the fuzzy-wuzzy feel-goods you get from the conclusion of a good story. And I so wish that I could end this section right here, except that it's kind of questionable. You see, I was thinking about it later, and the context that the new ending casts onto previous events is weird. It's not exactly plot hole territory, but it's a bit paradoxical, and depending on how you interpret it, it may sour one of the main character's most important arcs. I don't know. It feels like a bit of a nitpick because I truly understand what the writers were going for, and it's so close to being flawlessly executed. And it's the kind of thing that could have been quote-unquote fixed with just 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, if you presume it needs fixing. Since I do understand the spirit with which the story is told and the intention the writers had, I choose to account for it the way they intended it. But the truth is, there's a bit of potential dissonance in the story here that some people may find distasteful. It just depends on how it's interpreted. Personally, I've chosen to give the writers the benefit of the doubt, but I would totally understand if someone else was less gracious. As far as the story goes, the ending will be either the best or the worst part for most people. Such is the fate of the end of most narratives, I'm afraid. It is what it is. Sea of Stars is an experience that I thoroughly enjoyed. It is fun and charming and thoughtful and polished. It stands on the shoulders of giants, combining some of the most iconic and enjoyable features from its predecessors, and reaches for the stars by implementing creative solutions and clever alternatives to some of the genre's most unsavory conventions. I looked forward to playing it each day, and I was sad when my adventure finally came to an end. Sure, it may not always reach its full potential, but neither do I. While it may not be particularly deep or complex, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is a lean and finely tuned experience that does what it does well, and it deserves credit for truly refining the turn-based RPG genre. The story, with its straightforward characters and dependence on genre tropes, cliches, and a little bit of timey-wimey fucky-wucky, will certainly not be to everyone's taste, but I had a lot of fun with it. And it's safe to say that the graphics, music, and the gameplay are at the head of their class and should leave little room for complaint from anyone. The passion from the team over at Sabotage is on display in every moment of this delightful adventure. With this dedication to quality and standard of craftsmanship, it would seem they have a very bright future ahead of them. I will be waiting in anticipation of the Sea of Stars DLC, so that I may be enchanted by this truly special experience one more time, even if it's only for a little bit. In the meantime, I wonder if I should go back and give their first game, The Messenger, a try.